In 1958, Ferrari had everything: the money, the history, the screaming Italian engines, the best racing team on earth, on home soil, with everything to prove and everyone expecting them to win. They were beaten by a company that made engine bearings in a factory in West London, not a car maker, a parts supplier. A man named Tony Vandervell, who built precision bearings for a living, and who became so obsessed with humbling Ferrari that he spent a fortune building his own Grand Prix car for one reason and one reason only: to beat the red cars, to wipe the smile off Italy. And here's the detail that turns this from a sports story into something almost Shakespearean. The very bearings that made Vandervell his fortune were the same bearings that had once saved Ferrari's engines from destroying themselves. The Englishman had helped build Ferrari up. Now he was going to tear them down. They told him a four-cylinder British engine couldn't beat a Ferrari V6. They were wrong. By the end of 1958, the first name ever carved onto Formula One's new Constructors' Trophy wasn't Ferrari. It wasn't Italian at all. It was a word that didn't even exist a few years earlier: Vanwall. But this is not a clean, happy story, because the same season that gave Britain its greatest motorsport triumph also took something from it that no trophy could ever replace. And the man who built it all walked away from the sport forever, just weeks after winning. This is how a bearing salesman from London out-engineered Ferrari, and what it cost him. To understand why one man would pour a fortune into beating Ferrari, you have to understand what kind of man Tony Vandervell was. And he was not a normal one. Vandervell had made himself seriously rich on something almost nobody thinks about: the bearings that sit inside an engine, the small precision parts that let metal spin against metal thousands of times a second without tearing itself apart. His company made the best in the world. Dull, you might think. But those bearings made him wealthy, and they made him connected, and they gave him the means to chase the thing he actually cared about, which was racing. He didn't ease into it. In the early 1950s, Britain's big national racing hope was a team called BRM, a patriotic, all-British effort to take on the continent. Vandervell backed it with his money, and then he watched it fail, strangled by exactly the thing he despised most in the world: committees, meetings, decisions made by groups of cautious men who could never agree. He called it committee racing, and he said it with contempt. So he did what men like him do when they think everyone around them is getting it wrong. He quit, took his money, and decided to build a car himself. One man, one vision, no committee. And he picked his enemy deliberately. Not just anyone. Ferrari. The proud, dominant, untouchable red cars from Italy that ruled Grand Prix racing and treated the British as amateurs who didn't belong. Vandervell wanted them specifically. He wanted to beat Enzo Ferrari at his own game, on his own track, with a British car. But here's where the story bites down on something genuinely strange, a piece of history so neat you'd think someone invented it. Because Tony Vandervell already knew Ferrari, intimately. His bearings, those same precision parts that built his fortune, had been used in Ferrari's own racing engines. His technology had helped keep Ferrari's V12S alive when they might otherwise have shaken themselves to pieces. He had, in a very real sense, helped make Ferrari fast. Sit with that. The man who set out to destroy Ferrari was a man who had spent years helping to build them. He knew their strengths from the inside because some of those strengths were his. And now he was going to turn everything he knew against them. The only problem was that at the start, his cars weren't good enough. Not even close. And to fix that, he was about to do something no patriotic British team boss was supposed to do. Vandervell's first move tells you everything about how his mind worked. He didn't start by designing a British car to beat Ferrari. He started by buying Ferraris. He bought their cars, brought them home, fitted them with his own bearings, and went racing under a cheeky name, the Thinwall Special. On the surface it looked like vanity, a rich man playing with red cars. It was nothing of the sort. It was reconnaissance. Every race, every mile, Vandervell and his engineers were studying the enemy from the inside out, learning how a winning Grand Prix car was actually put together, what made it fast, where it was weak. He was taking Ferrari apart to learn how to build something better, spy, then surpass. And when he finally built his own car and called it the Vanwall, a name stitched together from his own surname and his Thinwall bearings, he did the second unthinkable thing. He refused to be a flag waver about it. A patriotic British team was supposed to use British everything. Vandervell didn't care about that. He cared about winning, so he went out and assembled what was, in effect, an international dream team of talent, dragging the best ideas from wherever they happened to live. For the shape of the car, he hired a young designer most people had never heard of yet, a man named Colin Chapman, who would later go on to found Lotus and become one of the most brilliant minds in the entire history of motorsport. Chapman gave the Vanwall a modern, lightweight frame. Then, Vandervell brought in an aerodynamicist named Frank Costin, who shaped the body into a smooth, slippery teardrop so clean that on a fast straight, the red Ferraris simply could not stay with it through the air. And then he went shopping abroad, in enemy-adjacent territory. He took fuel injection technology from Bosch in Germany. He used advanced disc brakes derived from aviation know-how, so his car could slow down later and harder than the Italians, who were still relying on older drum brakes. Piece by piece, Vandervell wasn't building a British car. He was building the best car, and he didn't care what passport its ideas carried. There was just one weakness left, and on paper, it was a big one. The thing under the bonnet. Here's the part the engineers said couldn't work. Ferrari's 1958 car had a V6 engine, 6 cylinders. By the logic of the era, more cylinders meant smaller, neater combustion chambers, which let you run the engine harder without it destroying itself, especially on the strict new aviation-grade fuel the rules now demanded. The Vanwall, by contrast, had a big, rough 4-cylinder engine, fewer, larger cylinders. By the textbook, it was the wrong choice. It should have left the Vanwall at a disadvantage every time the cars lined up. So the experts did the maths and reached the obvious conclusion. A 4-cylinder British engine could not beat a Ferrari 5.6 over a full Grand Prix season. The numbers said so. The numbers were wrong, because the numbers only looked at the engine, and Vandervell hadn't built an engine. He'd built a whole car, and every other part of it was quietly superior. The Vanwall's 4-cylinder might have been theoretically outgunned, but it was strong, it made tremendous power low down, and it was wrapped in a car that cut through the air better, stopped harder, and was honed by some of the sharpest minds in the sport. The Ferrari might win the argument on a spec sheet. The Vanwall won it on a racetrack. That is the whole difference between engineering on paper and engineering that actually crosses the finish line first, and it's the lesson sitting at the heart of this entire story. But a great car is nothing without someone to drive it. And this is where Vanwall's story stops being about machinery and starts being about 3 remarkable men, one of whom would not survive the season. Vandervell put 3 drivers in his cars, and the partnership at the front was something special. The first was Stirling Moss, and if you know only one name from this era of British racing, it should be his. Moss is very probably the greatest driver who never won the World Championship, a man whose sheer speed and car control put him on a level almost no one else of his time could touch. In a Vanwall, he was frequently untouchable. The second was Tony Brooks, and he came with one of the great nicknames in the sport, the racing dentist, because that's exactly what he was, a qualified dental surgeon who raced Grand Prix cars at the absolute limit on the side. Brooks drove with a smoothness and mechanical sympathy that meant he rarely broke his car, and when the pressure was highest, he delivered. His win that year at the terrifying Nürburgring, 14 miles of forest and fear, the most dangerous circuit in the world, was a masterclass. The third was a young man named Stuart Lewis Evans, quick, brave, mentored by Moss himself, and widely seen as a future champion in the making. Remember his name. The season will come back to him. Across 1958, Moss and Brooks took the fight to Ferrari race after race. 3 wins for Moss, 3 wins for Brooks. 6 victories that season, the British green cars beating the Italian red ones in their own arena, again and again. When the points were counted at the end of the year, Vanwall had 48 to Ferrari's 40. The very first Constructors Championship in the history of Formula One, a brand new prize, created that exact season to honor the best team and the best car, went not to Ferrari, not to Italy, but to a British outfit founded by a bearing manufacturer who'd been told it couldn't be done. Vanwall's name went onto that trophy first, before Ferrari, before everyone. To this day, no matter who wins it now, the first name on Formula One's Constructors' Roll of Honour is that strange little word from a factory in Acton. It should have been the happiest day of Tony Vandervell's life. It was one of the worst. Because triumph and tragedy arrived in 1958 holding hands, and you cannot tell this story honestly without both. Start with the cruelest near miss in the sport's history. Stirling Moss, who had done so much to win the team its title, lost the individual drivers' championship that year, the one trophy he wanted most, by a single point. 1 point. And the way he lost it is almost unbearable to recount because it was a direct result of his own decency. Earlier in the season, his rival Mike Hawthorne, a Ferrari driver, was facing disqualification from a race over a technicality. Moss, instead of staying silent and letting his competitor lose the points, stood up and spoke in Hawthorne's defense, arguing that he'd done nothing wrong. Hawthorne was reinstated, he kept his points, and at the end of the year, those were the exact points that beat Stirling Moss to the championship by 1. Moss handed his greatest rival the title by refusing to win it dishonestly. There may be no finer act of sportsmanship in the history of motor racing, and it cost him everything he'd fought for. But that's not the wound at the centre of this season. The real one came at the final race, in Morocco. Stuart Lewis Evans, the young driver marked out as a future champion, the one I told you to remember, crashed when his engine failed at high speed. The car caught fire. He suffered terrible burns, and despite being flown home to England for treatment, he died days later. The boy everyone believed would one day be champion was gone, and it broke Tony Vandervell. Think about what that moment actually was. Vandervell had spent years and a fortune, and the whole force of his stubborn will chasing one dream, beating Ferrari and winning the title. He'd just done it. He'd just achieved the thing that was supposed to make all of it worth it. And in the very same handful of weeks, a young man who'd raced for him, who'd trusted him, who'd climbed into a car Vandervell had built, was dead. The price of the dream turned out to be more than the dream was worth. Vandervell's health was already failing. His doctors had told him to rest, but it was the loss of Lewis Evans more than anything that took the fire out of him. The man who hated committees, who'd quit BRM in disgust, who'd bought Ferraris just to take them apart, who'd built an international dream team out of pure obsession, he didn't have it in him anymore. He wound the team down. Vanwall, the most successful British Grand Prix team of its moment, the first ever Constructors Champion, effectively walked away from the sport at the very peak of its powers, while still champion. It is one of the only times in racing history that a team won everything and then simply stopped. So what do we actually take from all this? The easy lesson is the one written on the trophy. A British underdog beat the mighty Ferrari. The little guy won. Roll the credits. But that's not the real story, and you deserve the real one. The real story is that Vanwall didn't win because they were British, and they didn't win because they were plucky. They won because one stubborn, brilliant, impossible man refused to accept how things were supposed to be done. He was told to race by committee, or he refused. He was told to wave the flag and use only British parts. He refused, and took the best ideas from Germany, from aviation, from anywhere they lived. He was told a 4-cylinder engine couldn't beat a V6's, and instead of arguing the point, he built a better car around it and let the results do the talking. Every single time the conventional wisdom told Tony Vandervell what was possible, he treated it as a personal insult and went and proved it wrong. That's why Vanwall's name is first on that trophy. Not luck, not patriotism, a refusal to be told what couldn't be done. And the tragedy woven through it is what stops this being a fairy tale and makes it something you'll actually remember. Vandervell got everything he wanted and discovered in the same breath that getting what you want can cost more than you ever meant to pay. He beat Ferrari. He lost a young man he'd brought into his world, and he was never the same again. 60-odd years later, every team that lifts the Constructors' Trophy is standing in a line that begins with him, a bearing manufacturer from West London who hated losing so much that he outthought, outbuilt, and out-engineered the most feared name in motor racing, and then quietly walked away from the sport, carrying a grief no trophy could ever lift. That's the Vanwall story. the underdog that beat Ferrari by simply refusing to believe the people who said it couldn't.